Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 20 stories for you, including the Static Occupant, the Residual Echo in the Glass, the Feedback Tenant, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Static Occupant. I am standing in the hallway of my parents' old ranch house, but my feet are anchored to the heavy oak door that leads downward. Above me, the world is familiar, the smell of dust and floor wax. Below, however, lies a bunker carved into the limestone, a 1950s fallout shelter that has been sealed for 40 years. I pushed the heavy iron handle, and the air that rushed out felt thick, like it had been holding its breath since the Eisenhower administration. I descend the concrete stairs, my flashlight cutting a yellow path through the gloom. The walls are lined with rusted canisters and old bicycles, but at the far end of the room sits the centerpiece, a heavy wooden rocking chair. It is positioned perfectly in the center of the floor, facing the opposite wall. As I step into the chamber, the silence is absolute, yet I hear it, a rhythmic, steady creak. The chair is moving. It sways back and forth, a slow, deliberate motion that suggests someone just sat up to watch me arrive. I walk toward it, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I whisper into the stillness. There is no reply, only the persistent creak thrum of the wood. I reach out to touch the armrest, expecting to feel the warmth of a body, but my hand meets something startlingly cold and grainy. The chair isn't empty. Sitting in it is a figure made entirely of dead channel snow. It isn't solid like a human. Instead, it looks like a television screen tuned to a station with no signal. It is a swirling mass of flickering white noise, shimmering with tiny sparks of silver and charcoal. The texture is pebbled, like coarse sand, yet it flows like liquid. As I watch, the static begins to ripple. The figure doesn't have a permanent face, rather, it is constantly reshaping itself. Because my father used to sit in this chair every night while watching the news, the entity has molded its proportions into his likeness. It has his broad shoulders and the slight slouch of an old man, but instead of skin, it is composed of a constant blizzard of microscopic dots. When it moves, it doesn't just shift, it crackles softly, like a fireplace burning in a distant room. The static ripples across its chest, forming the phantom impression of a sweater. I take another step forward, and the figure reacts. It doesn't turn its head, it simply flows toward me, the snow particles migrating to the front. It mimics my own posture now. Because I am standing before it with wide eyes and a slightly parted mouth, the static on its face begins to settle into an expression of mild surprise. It is capturing my silhouette. The rocking motion becomes faster, more frantic. Creak thrum, creak thrum. The snow starts to shed from its shoulders, falling to the floor like powdered sugar. I realize that as it sits in the chair, it isn't just mimicking the person who last held the remote, it is absorbing the memory of the viewer. It becomes a living recording. I reach out and finally lay my hand on its head. The static feels like tiny needles pricking my skin, each grain vibrating with energy. For a moment, the flickering slows down. The figure stabilizes. It stops being a generic blur and takes on the sharp, distinct features of me, my own messy hair, my own high cheekbones, my own startled expression. I am looking at a version of myself made of television frost. I feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to climb back up the stairs into the sunlight where things are solid and certain. But as I turn to retreat, the chair gives one final, violent lurch forward. The figure doesn't just sit there anymore. It leans toward me, its snow face smoothing out into a perfect mirror of my own face. It opens its mouth, and a soft hiss of white noise escapes its lips. "I see you," it seems to hum through the static. I back away, my heels clicking on the concrete, but even as I reach the stairs, the chair continues to rock. It is no longer just mimicking me, it is waiting for me to sit down so it can finally take over. The Residual Echo in the Glass. To whoever takes the midnight shift at Bottling Plant 4, please listen closely before you start the conveyor belts. The lights-out schedule is the most demanding part of our operation because the machinery has a way of mimicking life when it thinks no one is watching. At first, you will only notice the rhythmic pulse of the cooling fans, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. But as the hours pass, the silence begins to feel heavy, almost thick enough to touch. By hour 3, you might hear a sound that doesn't belong to any gear or piston. It's a soft, wet click, like a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth. That is when I first noticed it in my own throat during last night's shift. At first, I thought I was just tired. My own movements felt heavy, as if my limbs were moving through shallow water. Then, the sensation shifted from sluggishness to a strange, internal displacement. It started at my left shoulder. Every time I reached for a crate, there was a ghost weight pressing against my blade, a phantom limb that wasn't mine but seemed to be trying to coordinate with mine. By midnight, the feeling spread to my ribs. It felt as though someone had placed their hands inside my chest cavity, rearranging my internal organs like a sculptor molding clay. I found myself breathing in a cadence that didn't match my own lungs, a deeper, more deliberate inhale that seemed to pull from an external source. Then came the visual cues. I wasn't seeing ghosts. I was feeling a presence that was literally grafting itself onto my skeleton. When I looked at my hands, they occasionally twitched in opposite directions of my will. My thumb would curl inward while my palm pushed outward. It was as if I were becoming a duet of motion. By 2 a.m., the sensation reached my face. My jaw felt stiff, as if held by invisible threads from behind. When I spoke, my voice had a faint, secondary resonance, a hum beneath the words that sounded like a choir of one. I realized then that I wasn't just working alongside an entity, I was being inhabited by it. It is the twin of every reflection, the sum total of every version of me that has ever existed in a mirror's brief embrace. It isn't a shadow or a spirit. It is a collection of my own possibilities, the me that smiled just a second ago, the me from this morning's coffee, the me that might have turned left instead of right. Because it exists in the periphery of perception, it only manifests when the world is still. It doesn't have a face of its own so much as it has a collection of my features arranged in a slightly different order. Its skin feels like velvet stretched over hot wax. Its hair is composed of thousands of tiny, iridescent filaments that shimmer like copper wire. When I finally stood still near the assembly line at 4 a.m., the sensation peaked. It wasn't just pressing on my bones anymore, it was merging with them. My spine felt like a bridge being crossed by a steady traveler. My skin began to ache with the pressure of 2 sets of pores breathing in unison. I could feel its joints slotting into mine, its vertebrae clicking against my own. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the warehouse floor, the transformation was nearly complete. I felt less like a person walking through a factory and more like a house being occupied by a guest who had finally decided to move in permanently. When you feel that sudden, sharp ache in your collarbone, don't be alarmed. Don't try to push it away. Just accept that for the next 8 hours, you are no longer an individual. You are a shared space. As I walked out of the bay door this morning, I felt its final adjustment, a slight pull at my crown, as if it were straightening my posture from behind. You will find that by the time your shift ends, your own movements will feel slightly foreign, and your pulse will beat with a secondary rhythm you didn't choose. Just be warned, when you finally leave the plant and look into your own reflection tonight, do not be surprised if your reflection blinks a fraction of a second. After you do. The Feedback Tenant. I thought the truck stop shower block was a place of solitude, but as I sat on the cracked plastic stool waiting for my turn, I realized it was a theater. The air smelled of damp concrete and industrial soap, a heavy scent that clung to the back of my throat. When I finally stepped into the stall, the steam rising from the communal pipes felt like a veil lifting over something hidden. It started with a hum in the ventilation duct, a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to vibrate against my molars. Then, the voice arrived. It wasn't a physical presence at first, just a sound peeling off the metal slats of the vent. You are reaching for the soap. I froze. My hand was midair, hovering over the porcelain dish. I hadn't spoken a word, yet the voice had confirmed my intent with perfect clarity. It wasn't human in its timbre. It sounded like a recording of a person being played through a layer of velvet and electricity. You are scrubbing your left elbow, it narrated as I began to lather up. The feedback whine started then, a rising pitch that felt like a physical weight in the room. Every time the voice spoke, the whine climbed higher, a sharp needle of sound that grew more intense with every syllable. By the time I reached for my shampoo, the The pitch had sharpened into a frantic, whistling trill. It was reacting to my movements, narrating them before they were fully complete, as if it were anticipating the rhythm of my muscles. "You are wondering if you are alone," the voice whispered, the whine reaching a crescendo that made the water droplets dance on the tiles. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched by something invisible yet intimate. The narration grew more complex as I rinsed the soap away. It stopped just describing my actions and began describing my internal state. "You are feeling the sudden chill of a draft." A gust of air did indeed sweep through the stall, though the door was shut. "You are realizing that the voice is not waiting for you to move," it continued, the whine now so high it felt like a tiny bird vibrating inside my skull. The pitch began to fold. This was the strangest part. The sound didn't just get higher, it started to curl inward on itself, becoming dense and textured. It sounded like 1,000 glass marbles rolling over silk. Then, the voice changed its tone, becoming more urgent. "You are looking up at the vent." I did. There was nothing there but a rusted grate, yet as I stared, a physical shape began to manifest from the sound itself. It wasn't a body made of flesh. It was a mouth, a massive, circular aperture of vibrating membranes and iridescent scales that seemed to be woven out of pure frequency. It didn't have teeth, it had rows of crystalline ridges that hummed as they moved. The mouth hovered just below the grate, its edges shimmering like oil on water. "You are beginning to fear the silence," it narrated, the whine reaching a piercing, melodic scream. I held my breath, terrified that even the smallest exhale would trigger a new sentence. The mouth pulsed, its membranes rippling as if it were tasting the humidity of my breath. It didn't move toward me, but it felt as though it were leaning in, its very existence defined by the narrative of my existence. I realized then that the voice wasn't just observing me, it was consuming the moment as it happened. Every gesture I made was a gift to this thing. "You are preparing to leave," it murmured, the whine dropping to a low, satisfied thrum. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The mouth opened wide, its crystalline ridges glowing with a faint, amber light. It didn't wait for me to move. It spoke as my fingers touched the metal. "You are stepping out into the cold." I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, the sound of the whine following me like a trailing tail. The vent was empty again, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. As I walked toward the exit, a final, tiny echo drifted from the ceiling, barely audible above the distant roar of the engines outside. You are listening for its next thought. The Archive of Residual Impressions, 2:15 a.m. Entry, Basement Level 4, Medical Records Archive. The air down here doesn't move. It sits like a heavy, damp blanket smelling of old paper and antiseptic. I am the night watchman, and my job is simple. Walk the perimeter, check the integrity of the towering steel shelves, and ensure the silence remains unbroken. Tonight, however, the silence feels intentional, as if the room is holding its breath. 2:34 a.m. Entry, Aisle 12, Pediatrics. The hum of the overhead fluorescent light flickers rhythmically. It shouldn't be humming this loudly, but every time it pulses, I feel a slight vibration in my teeth. I notice something on the floor, a faint indentation in the dust. It is not a smudge, but a crisp, sharp depression in the grit, shaped like a human heel. It sits perfectly still, as if a foot were pressed into the earth and then pulled away with surgical precision. 3:10 a.m. Entry, Aisle 24, Neurology. The temperature has dropped. I can see my breath blooming in small white puffs before vanishing. As I walk past the heavy oak filing cabinets, I hear a sound like wet velvet being dragged over stone. It is soft, rhythmic, and coming from the far corner of the room. There are 3 more footprints now, spaced 6 feet apart. They aren't just marks, they are pools of deep frost. The center of each print glows with a faint, pearlescent shimmer, as if the cold itself has crystallized into something solid. 3:45 a.m. Entry, Central Hub. I stopped moving for a full minute because the sound changed. It is no longer a drag. It is a steady, deliberate pulse of freezing air. The footprints are appearing in real time now, blooming from the darkness like flowers made of ice. They are marching toward me. Each one looks like a miniature crater of winter, with jagged edges that seem to vibrate. One footprint appeared directly at my toes. I felt the temperature plunge so sharply that the hair on my arms stood straight up. The frost isn't just sitting there, it is expanding outward in ripples, tiny crystalline spikes reaching toward my boots. For 12 a.m. Entry, aisle 38, orthopedics. My flashlight beam cuts through the gloom, catching the movement. The cold is no longer just a series of marks on the floor. It has begun to gather into a cohesive mass of shivering atmosphere. It moves with a heavy, rolling grace, like a slow-motion wave of sleet. It doesn't have a body in the traditional sense. It is a hovering collection of freezing mist that takes the shape of a slumped, kneeling figure. It lacks a face or limbs, but its head, a swirling vortex of snowflakes and frozen vapor, is focused entirely on me. 4:38 a.m. Entry, the dead end. I am backed against the far wall now. The cold has reached my knees. Every time it moves forward, the sound is a low, mournful whistle, like wind moving through a keyhole. It isn't just cold, it feels heavy, pressing against my skin with the weight of a winter storm. I can feel the moisture in the air turning to tiny diamonds on my cheeks. 5:02 a.m. Entry, the contact point. The entity is now inches from my face. It doesn't have eyes, but I feel its gaze. It reaches out, not with a hand, but with an extension of its freezing core. It wraps around my shoulders like a shawl of liquid nitrogen. 5:15 a.m. Entry, final observation. The movement has ceased completely. The air is so cold that the paper files on the nearby shelves have begun to crack and curl. I can feel the entity's temperature leaching into my marrow, turning my heartbeat into a slow, muffled thud of ice. 5:30 a.m. Entry, completion. The cold has finally settled. It is no longer a moving thing. It has become a permanent part of this corner of the archive. I am still standing here, frozen in a perfect statue of my own fear. I realize now that the footprints weren't just marks left behind by something passing through. They were the trail of its hunger. 5:45 a.m. Entry, exit. The silence has returned, but it is no longer heavy. It is brittle. As I turn to leave, I notice the last footprint on the floor. It isn't a heel mark anymore. In the center of the frost, there is a perfect, tiny indentation where a single human thumbprint was pressed into the ice by something that isn't quite human yet. The Correction of Elias. The freight elevator was a brutalist cage of rusted iron and smelling of old grease. It had lurched upward from the basement, carrying me and a stack of heavy crates, before the cables groaned and surrendered to gravity. We were suspended in the velvet silence between the third and fourth floors, neither rising nor falling, just hovering in a pocket of stagnant air. I sat on the floor, my back against the cool metal wall, watching the dust motes dance in the single flickering bulb above. Then, from the opposite corner, came the sound of a soft, wet intake of breath. It wasn't mine. In the dim yellow light, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was not human, though it mimicked the shape of a man. Its skin had the texture of hammered copper, bronzed and pitted. Instead of hair, a crown of iridescent feathers sprouted from its scalp. Most unsettling were its eyes, two large, amber spheres that lacked pupils entirely, like marbles trapped in honey. It didn't move toward me immediately. It simply sat, its body folding into itself with the grace of a collapsing accordion. "Good evening, little cricket," it whispered. The voice was melodic but raspy, as if speaking through a throat filled with smooth river stones. I froze. Little Cricket was the name my grandmother had given me when I was 6, a secret nickname she'd whispered during long winter nights. No one else in the world knew it. The entity blinked its amber eyes and shifted, its copper skin making a faint clinking sound. "You are surprised," it said. It is a common reaction for those who find themselves caught in the seam of the building. It reached out with a hand that possessed 5 knuckles, but only 3 joints per finger, pointing at me with a gesture of profound dignity. I tried to speak, but my throat felt lined with wool. The entity took this silence as an invitation and began to speak in a formal, rhythmic tone. "We gather here today to honor the passage of Elias," it announced, its voice echoing off the metal walls. a man of profound patience who lived among the shadows of the corridors. I blinked, wondering if it was mourning me or some other traveler from the past. The entity paused, its amber eyes gleaming. Elias died in a tragic accident when his heart simply ceased to beat while he was reading a book. It bowed slightly. Then, almost instantly, its expression shifted into one of mild annoyance. Actually, it corrected itself. No, that is incorrect. Elias died because the silence became too heavy for him to carry, and he folded into a permanent slumber. It took another breath, the wet sound echoing in the cramped space. Let us correct that again. Elias did not fold. He was snatched by the corner of a dream and pulled into the underside of the floorboards. The entity seemed to be searching for the perfect truth, its copper skin shimmering as it pondered the possibilities. Every few seconds, it would pivot on a new fact, refining the eulogy with increasing precision. Elias died, it stated again, not by snatching, but by being forgotten by the very room he inhabited. I felt my own breath hitch. The elevator wasn't just stuck, it was becoming an audience. With every correction, the entity grew taller, its feathers rustling like silk against stone. It began to move closer, its copper limbs clicking in a rhythmic cadence. / he died, it insisted, its voice rising in volume, because he realized that his name was being spoken by something that didn't have a mouth. It leaned in until the amber spheres were inches from my nose. I could smell toasted cinnamon and old parchment. / the entity took one final breath, its feathers vibrating with intensity. Elias died, it whispered, perfectly clear this time, because he finally realized that he was not the one being remembered, but the one doing the remembering. It straightened up, its copper skin dulling as if its energy were spent. Actually, it added in a tiny, conspiratorial voice, he died because you are still listening to him. The elevator gave a violent shudder and began to move upward again. The entity didn't move an inch from its spot in the corner, its amber eyes fixed on mine. I realized then that as the floor rose, it wasn't just my body moving, the room was beginning to exhale. I looked at the copper figure and saw a new shadow stretch across the floor, a shadow of a man holding a book, standing just behind me. Good evening, I whispered back, as the freight elevator lurched into the dark. The synchronized breath of the attic. Day 4. The attic is no longer silent. It isn't just the settling of floorboards or the hum of the wind. There is a rhythm now. My son, Leo, sleeps soundly in the nursery below, but directly above him, something has moved into my storage space. At first, I thought it was just an echo of his own breathing, a resonant vibration traveling through the rafters. But tonight, the sound became distinct. It is a heavy, wet inhalation followed by a sharp, whistling exhale. Day 9. The rhythm is consistent. Every time Leo takes a deep breath in sleep, a second breath follows it from above, perfectly timed, like two metronomes swinging in unison. I sat in the nursery chair today and counted them. Inhale, inhale, exhale, exhale. It is not a delay, it is a mirror. The attic entity seems to be copying Leo's lungs, mimicking his tiny pulse with its own massive capacity. Day 14. I climbed the ladder today to investigate. The dust was thick, but there were no footprints except for my own. In the center of the room stood the collar. It is a bizarre construction of anatomy. From the waist up, it possesses the torso and head of a towering, broad-shouldered giant with skin the color of weathered copper. From the waist down, however, it has the slender, graceful legs of a nimble woodland sprite, ending in feet that look like smooth river stones. It doesn't move much. It simply stands there, looming. Day 21. The collar is reacting to me now. When I enter the room, it doesn't just breathe with Leo. It breathes with me. If I hold my breath, it holds its own. If I gasp in surprise, it mirrors the sharp intake of air. It feels as though it is trying to inhabit my lungs through sheer observation. Day 28. The breathing has changed pace. It is faster now, more frantic. Leo is having a restless night, and the collar is keeping up with his jagged, staccato gasps. I noticed something strange today when I looked at the giant upper half of the creature. Its face is wide and serene, but its sprite-like legs are twitching constantly, as if it wants to run but is anchored by its heavy head. Day 35. It began to move tonight. Not toward me, but toward Leo's room. I heard the wood groan. The caller was descending the ladder. I watched from the doorway as it reached into the nursery. Its copper-skinned face hovered inches above my son's sleeping head. It didn't touch him. It simply aligned its own nose with his, seeking that perfect synchronization. Day 42. The sync is becoming absolute. There is no longer a gap between Leo's breath and the caller's breath. They are moving as one unit. When I am in the room, I feel a strange pressure in my chest, as if my own lungs are being pulled toward the entity. Day 50. The copper skin of its upper half has started to change. Where it spent the most time hovering over Leo, the metal-like texture is softening, turning a warm peach color, almost as if it were absorbing his warmth. Its sprite legs have grown longer, reaching out to touch the edges of the crib. Day 60. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the room silent. No breathing. Not from Leo, and not from the attic. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, a sound came from the corner. A tiny, high-pitched wheeze. Day 61. I looked toward the crib. Leo was awake, his eyes wide open. The collar was no longer standing above him. It was sitting on the floor, its heavy copper head resting on its lap, its sprite legs folded like a resting moth. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. It wasn't mimicking Leo anymore. Day 62. I realized then that the synchronization had finished. The collar hadn't been learning from Leo. It had been preparing to trade places. I watched as my son took a deep, rattling breath. For once, the collar did not follow. Instead, it let out a sigh of perfect completion, and as it did, its copper face began to fold inward, shrinking toward its chest until there was nothing left but a faint, lingering hum in the air. Day 63. Leo is sleeping soundly again. I am sitting in the chair, watching him. But when I listen closely, I realize the breathing isn't coming from my son anymore. It is coming from the empty space where the collar used to be. The attic is no longer silent. It isn't just the settling of floorboards or the hum of the wind. There is a rhythm now. The Ballast Chamber Chat. Beekeeper's Note. Late autumn. The nectar is scarce, and the drones are beginning to retreat into their waxen cells. There is a peculiar stillness in the apiary this year, as if the bees are anticipating a guest they haven't yet seen. It reminded me of my time spent aboard the Aurelia, a massive freighter left moored in the brackish waters of the northern coast for 3 years. I was tasked with cataloging the inventory of its interior, specifically the labyrinthine ballast tanks, vast, cavernous hollows that hold water to balance the ship's weight. On my final night alone, the air inside the steel ribs felt heavy, thick with the scent of salt and old grease. I sat on a rusted crate in Tank 4, carrying a portable typewriter and a flickering lantern. The silence was absolute until the first click of the keys broke it. I began to type a simple observation about the humidity, but as I struck the final period, a faint sound echoed from the far corner of the hull, a rhythmic, wet thrumming. It sounded like a heartbeat muffled by velvet. To test the acoustics, I typed, "Is there anyone else here?" The words sat on the page for 3 seconds before a reply appeared in my mind, not as a voice, but as a vibration in the floorboards. Then, a sound came from just behind the crate, a dry, papery rustle of something unfolding. It wasn't a ghost, it was physical. Every time I stopped typing, something moved. When I typed "The air tastes of iron," the shadow at the edge of my lantern's reach shifted. It was a creature of geometry and texture, possessing 12 jointed limbs that looked like polished mahogany wood. Each limb ended in a wide, flat pad covered in tiny, hair-like cilia. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a cluster of vibrating crystalline shards that hummed when it sensed movement. I typed, "You're very close." The creature reacted instantly. It didn't walk so much as unfold. It moved with a series of rapid-fire snaps, its dozen legs tucking and expanding like the bellows of an accordion. It was hungry for warmth. Every time I took a breath or let my hand rest on the keys, it would lunge forward to occupy the space I had just vacated. If I typed a sentence about the cold, it would fold its limbs into a tight, spherical knot around the spot where my elbow had been resting a second before. It was a scavenger of heat, a weaver of thermal memories. By the time I reached the middle of my notes, the creature was no longer at the far corner. It was circling me, orbiting my body like a moon around a planet. Each movement produced a soft, clackshire sound as the mahogany limbs folded against one another. I began to type faster, my pulse racing. "Do you prefer the warmth of the metal or the warmth of the breath?" I asked. The creature paused. It reached out with two of its primary limbs and touched the spot where my chin had rested just moments ago. It didn't just touch it, it seemed to press into the air, pulling the lingering heat into its own body until the space felt suddenly chilled. I realized then that it wasn't just watching me, it was sampling me. It was recording the temperature of my existence. As the lantern flickered lower, the creature began to move with more urgency. It no longer waited for me to finish a thought. It moved as soon as the vibration of the typing ceased. I typed, "Will you stay when the ink runs dry?" The response was immediate. It surged forward, its 12 legs splaying out across the floor like an opening flower, and it settled into the hollow of my lap. It folded its limbs inward, wrapping itself around my torso in a perfect, protective sphere of mahogany and cilia. I could feel its crystalline head vibrating against my ribs, humming a low, resonant note that vibrated through my bones. The heat was being sucked out of my chest with every passing second. I realized it wasn't just folding its legs around the spot I left, it was preparing to fold itself around what came next. I reached out one last time to strike the final key. "You are part of the ship now," I typed. The creature tightened its grip, the mahogany limbs locking into place with a definitive snap. It wasn't just holding me anymore, it was claiming the heat of my heart as its own permanent territory. When I finally stood up to leave, the crate remained empty, but the floor was still radiating a faint, lingering warmth where I had sat for so long. The Petal-Step of Polaris. Entry 1. The scree slope is a choir of grinding stone. At 3,000 feet, the treeline ends abruptly, leaving only the loose shale and the bruising purple of the approaching dusk. I have come here to map the silence. It is a peculiar thing, how the ground seems to hum when the wind dies down. Everything feels heavy, as if gravity has more grip on these rocks than it does in the valley below. Entry 4. The sun is dipping behind the jagged ridge. The transition from day to night is violent here. The light doesn't fade so much as it retreats. I can hear a sound that shouldn't exist, a faint, rhythmic clicking. It sounds like teeth tapping against stone, or perhaps just the mountain settling into its bones. Entry 9, I noticed it tonight. The star. Or rather, the space where the star should be. To my left, hanging in the velvet throat of the sky, is a puncture in the firmament. Astronomers call it a collapsed nova, a celestial light that vanished 3 centuries ago. Yet, as I stood on the slope, I felt a pull. It wasn't just visual, it was auditory. A low, resonant vibration pulsed from that empty point in the heavens. It hummed my name. Not human or traveler, but my specific name, a soft, sustained note of vowels and consonants that felt like a physical touch on my shoulder. Entry 12. The humming grew louder. It was no longer just a vibration, it was an invitation. As the darkness thickened, I saw a disturbance in the dust. Something was moving across the scree about 50 paces away. It didn't walk so much as it shed itself into existence. A figure of pressed flowers emerged from the shadows. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body composed of thousands of overlapping petals, marigolds for the torso, lavender for the limbs, and deep crimson roses forming a heavy, velvet head. Every time it moved, it didn't make the sound of a footfall. Instead, a shower of dried petals fell from its frame, settling on the stones like soft, papery rain. Entry 15. It is approaching. The flower entity moves with a slow, deliberate grace. Its face is a dense cluster of white lilies that seem to fan out as it breathes. When it speaks, the sound is the dry rustle of autumn foliage. It stopped 10 feet from me and pulsed once. The star in the sky flared with a ghost light, and my name echoed again, clearer this time. "Stay," the entity whispered, its voice sounding like silk tearing. Entry 18. I realized then that it isn't just moving across the slope, it is harvesting it. Each step it takes leaves a permanent footprint of crushed petals. The ground beneath it turns from gray stone to a carpet of ochre and violet. It reached out a hand made of interlocking jasmine vines. There was no skin, only the texture of woven stems. I felt a strange warmth radiating from its core, like a hearth fire burning in a hollow log. Entry 22. The humming is now a roar. The star is dragging me upward, pulling my weight toward that empty point in the sky. The flower figure has moved to stand directly in front of me. It is shedding petals rapidly now, a constant blizzard of dried botanicals falling around us. I can see its center, a glowing, amber seed where a heart should be. Entry 25. It spoke again, but this time it wasn't an invitation. Yield, it rustled. The name from the star and the voice of the flowers merged into one. My shadow began to stretch toward the ceiling of the sky. I felt my own body becoming brittle, my skin beginning to take on the texture of parchment. Entry 28. It is happening. The figure reached out and touched my chest with a finger made of a single, long hibiscus petal. At the point of contact, my breath hitched, and I felt a sudden, sharp dryness spread through my ribs. I am not just watching it, I am becoming part of its geography. Entry 30. The star has finally claimed its prize. The flower figure stepped back, its petals shimmering in the ghost light. It leaned down, its lily face inches from mine, and let out one final, melodic rustle. The ground beneath us is no longer stone, it is a thick layer of fallen memories, each one a petal of a different hue. I am standing still now, my knees locking into place as the mountain settles. Entry 31. The star is bright again, but it isn't white or yellow. It glows with the deep, bruised purple of a crushed violet. I look down at my hands and see that they are no longer flesh. They have turned to wood, and from my knuckles, tiny buds of jasmine are beginning to sprout. I am not moving anymore, because I have become the next step it will take. The Chronometer of the Borderlands. I was stationed at Post 42, a lonely stretch of gravel and iron where the kingdom of men met the kingdom of silence. It was a moonless night, the kind where the darkness feels heavy enough to touch, pressing against your skin like damp velvet. My job was simple: watch for travelers, signal the gatekeepers, and keep the lanterns burning. But on the 14th night of my shift, the border changed. It started with a hum in the air, a vibration that didn't come from the wind or the machinery. Then, out of the thick gloom, they appeared, the neighbors. They weren't humans, not exactly. They were tall, graceful shapes that moved with a fluid, swaying motion. Their faces were dominated by expressions of profound contentment, but there was a peculiar delay to their joy. When they walked toward me, their mouths remained in neutral lines until they were nearly within reach. Then, as if triggered by a hidden mechanism, their smiles would snap into place, a half-second too late for the moment of impact. It was as if their faces were catching up to their feelings, trying to harmonize with reality just a heartbeat after it had already happened. They didn't speak in words, but they spoke in memories. They gathered around me in a semicircle, their bodies swaying like tall grass in a phantom breeze. One neighbor stepped forward, its skin textured like weathered linen. It reached out and touched my shoulder with a hand that felt like warm wax. From its chest came the first eulogy, a voice that sounded like grinding gears muffled by moss. "He died of a broken heart," the neighbor whispered. The voice was resonant, vibrating in my marrow. I blinked, surprised. I hadn't seen anyone die yet today. But then another neighbor moved, its body twisting with an audible click. "No," it corrected, its smile widening a fraction of a second after the sound finished. "He died of a sudden chill." The first neighbor adjusted itself, its posture shifting as if remembering a new fact. Actually, it chimed in again, and this time the voice was deeper. "He died because he forgot to breathe." I realized then that they weren't mourning a person I knew, they were mourning the moment I looked away. Every time my gaze shifted from one neighbor to the next, their eulogies corrected themselves to fit the new perspective. The further out into the night we went, the more frantic the corrections became. The neighbors began to cluster closer, their smiles becoming wider and more frequent, snapping into place with rhythmic precision. "She died of a dream," one said. "No, she died because the sun grew tired," another countered. Better yet, she died because the silence became too loud. The air began to thicken with the weight of their constant revisions. I felt my own heart sink with their timing. Every time I blinked, the neighbors shifted. Their smiles were no longer just expressions. They were physical events that punctuated the air like a soft clap of hands. They weren't just telling stories. They were trying to perfect the narrative of existence through trial and error. The tension escalated as the neighbors began to move in unison. They started to circle me, their linen skin glowing faintly under the lantern light. The eulogies became a frantic, overlapping chorus of contradictions. He died of a spark. No, he died of an echo. Wait, he died because the shadow outpaced him. I tried to stand still, but the neighbors were restless. They began to lean in, their smiles arriving in rapid-fire succession, sometimes occurring twice in a single second. I could see the effort in their faces, the way their muscles strained to catch up to the emotion of the words. The silence between their corrections became just as important as the corrections themselves. It was the space where reality waited for the neighbors to decide what it should be. Then, the hum reached a crescendo. All the neighbors stopped moving at once. They stood in a perfect ring around me, their faces neutral. I held my breath, waiting for the final word, the ultimate correction that would settle everything. I looked directly into the center of the circle, focusing on the void between them. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own pulse. Then, every single neighbor smiled at the exact same moment. The smile was so wide it seemed to pull their skin taut, revealing a row of teeth that looked like smooth river stones. The eulogy came one last time, a collective whisper from 30 mouths speaking as one, and he died because he stayed to listen. They didn't vanish. They simply remained there, frozen in their perfect smiles. I realized then that they weren't just neighbors of the border, they were neighbors of my own observation. When I finally turned to walk back toward the gate, the neighbor closest to me spoke one last time, its smile lagging behind until it finally landed on my retreating back. No, it whispered, he died because he forgot that we were watching. The Marginalia of the Silent Wing, October 12th. I took the job at the Oak Haven Public Library because I craved solitude. There is something deeply meditative about a room full of sleeping stories. My task is simple. Inventory the unclassified section, the dusty, oversized volumes that don't quite fit into genres like history or fiction. Tonight, as I sat in the corner chair with my journal, I noticed something odd on page 42 of a nameless leather book. In the margin, someone had scrawled a single word, wait. The handwriting was elegant, slanted to the right. It looked remarkably like my own, though perhaps a bit more deliberate. October 14th. I spent 3 hours cataloging today. I found another mark in the same book. Beside wait, someone had added the word here. The ink is still fresh, darker than the surrounding text. It sits exactly 2 inches from the original word. My heart skipped a beat. I am certain no one else was in the library with me tonight. October 16th. Progress is steady. Today's edition is Listen. The handwriting is identical to my own, yet it feels heavier, as if the pen pressed down harder into the parchment. It is drifting further away from the first word now, moving toward the outer edge of the page like a wandering thought. October 18th. I felt a strange pressure in the air today, a thickness in the oxygen that made my ears pop. When I opened the book, there were 3 new words. Do not look up. They are spaced out perfectly. The handwriting is starting to change slightly. The curves of the letters are becoming sharper, more jagged, as if the hand writing them was shivering. October 20th. A heavy thud echoed from the ceiling, a dull, muffled sound like a velvet bag hitting wood. I froze. When I looked at the book, the words were, he is near. The handwriting has lost its elegance. It looks frantic now, the letters nearly overlapping one another. I stayed until midnight, watching the page. Every time I blinked, I felt as though something was standing just behind my shoulder. October 22nd. There was a knock at the heavy oak door of the library. It wasn't a sharp rap, but a soft, rhythmic pulse. Thrum, thrum. Who is there? I whispered to the empty room. No answer. Only the sound of dust settling on the shelves. I checked the book. The words were, he is ready. The ink was smudged in the center, as if a drop of moisture had fallen from above. October 24th. The knock happened again, but this time it didn't come from the door. It came from the floorboards directly beneath my chair. "Thrum Thrum, are you coming?" I asked aloud. The voice that answered wasn't a human voice. It was a textured sound, like two pieces of rough sandpaper rubbing together, vibrating through the air. Almost, it rasped. I didn't look up immediately. I was terrified that if I did, I would see its face. October 26th. The handwriting in the book has become a mess of scribbles. It no longer looks like my script at all. It is thick and looping, almost organic. The words are, "Close your eyes." I did as instructed. For 3 minutes, I kept my lids pressed shut. During those seconds, the air grew cold enough to turn my breath into a mist. I heard a sound of shifting weight, not a walk, but a slide. Something was moving across the floor, pulling itself along with something that sounded like wet silk being dragged over stone. October 28th. The knock is constant now. It doesn't wait for me to speak. Thrum thrum. It happens every time I breathe in. The voice has matured. It no longer rasps. It hums, a low frequency that makes the pens on my desk rattle. "Open them," it commanded. I opened my eyes and gasped. The library was different. The shadows weren't just dark spots. They were thick, like syrup. In the center of the room stood the visitor. It wasn't a ghost or a person in a shroud. It was a towering creature made of what looked like woven wicker and dried moss. It had no face, only a single, wide slit in the middle of its head that pulsed with a soft, amber glow. It didn't have limbs so much as dozens of waving ribbons of velvet that sprouted from its torso, twitching in the air. October 30th. The creature reached out one of its velvet ribbons and touched my forehead. Its touch was dry and smelled of old paper and cedar wood. I finally understood why it had been writing in my book all week. It wasn't just observing me, it was practicing how to be me. I looked down at the final page of the leather book. The handwriting was no longer mine, nor was it a mess. It was perfect, cleaner than any human hand could manage. It read, "Your turn." The creature leaned down, its amber slit widening until it took up nearly its entire head. Then, with a soft sigh that sounded like a closing book, it stepped into my skin, and I felt myself become the one waiting in the margins. The pre-written day. I am submitting this statement to the insurance company not as a plea for compensation, but as a formal attempt to categorize the inexplicable. It is difficult to put a price on a house that survived a storm but lost its soul in the process. My residence is located at Point 42, a high desert radar station situated so far past the last paved road that the wind sounds like it's trying to speak a language we haven't learned yet. It was there, 3 months ago, that I found the leather-bound journal resting on my kitchen table. There was no dust on its cover and no owner in sight. When I opened it, the first page contained today's date. The entry described exactly what I had eaten for breakfast, the specific way the sunlight hit the floorboards at noon, and even the precise moment I felt the first prickle of curiosity while opening the book. It was a perfect mirror of my reality, written in a script that looked like elegant, looping cursive. But it was the second page that caused the first true shift in my equilibrium. The date was for tomorrow. The entry read, "The air will turn heavy with the scent of ozone, and the shadow in the corner will begin to pulse." I laughed at first, dismissing it as a coincidence or a clever trick of a previous tenant. But when I woke up the next morning, the room did it exactly as described, heavy with ozone, with a rhythmic, pulsing distortion of light in the far corner that seemed to breathe like a lung. By the third day, the journal began to accelerate. It wasn't just describing my actions, it was dictating them. I found myself moving toward the radar dish at the exact moment the text predicted. The entries became more dense, filling with sensory details of things I hadn't yet experienced. By the end of the first week, I realized that as I read each morning's entry, the events were being pulled into existence by the ink itself. If the journal said I would find a blue stone in my pocket, the stone appeared there. If it said the wind would hum a low G note, the desert air complied. However, there was a physical cost to this predestination. The further into the future the journal looked, the more frantic the handwriting became. It started to describe an entity, the thing that lived in the radar station with me. The diary didn't give it a name, but it described its presence as the static. One evening, I sat by the fireplace and read the entry for the following night. The static will reach out, not with hands of flesh, but with a hum of electricity that pulls the hair from your skin into the shape of a palm. That night, while I was reading, the temperature plummeted. A sudden, sharp crackle of electricity filled the room, and my hair stood straight up on end. It didn't just rise, it began to migrate toward the center of my chest. The fine strands of hair on my forearms swept forward, aligning themselves into a perfect, jagged print of an open hand. I felt the pressure of invisible fingers pressing against my ribs, though there was nothing there but the hum. The journal was demanding that I meet the thing. On the 10th day, I reached the final page of the current cycle. The handwriting had become massive, sprawling across the paper in a desperate, jagged script. It read, "The static will settle on your shoulders, and you will finally hear what it has been whispering for 1,000 years." That night, the radar station groaned as if the metal ribs were being squeezed by a giant hand. I sat perfectly still in my chair. The static charge intensified until my skin crackled with tiny sparks of blue light. Then, the hair on my arms flattened out, becoming a permanent, textured map of a palm pressed against my chest. A weight settled onto my shoulders, not heavy like a stone, but firm like a warm coat of velvet electricity. I heard it then. It wasn't a voice, but a vibration that resonated in my teeth. "Stay," the static whispered into my mind. The next morning, I opened the journal to find the very last page. It was dated for the day after tomorrow. There were no words on it except for one single sentence at the bottom. "The static will take your place as the narrator." That evening, I felt my own body begin to stiffen, my skin turning into a texture of parchment and ink. My pulse slowed until it became a steady, rhythmic ticking, like a clock being wound by an invisible hand. As the final line of the journal was fulfilled, my physical form began to blur at the edges, dissolving into a mist of gray electricity. I looked down at my chest, where the hairprint of the palm remained perfectly preserved on my skin, and realized that I was no longer moving because I had become part of the page. The house is silent now, save for the hum of the desert wind and the sound of a new journal being born on the kitchen table, waiting for the next soul to read what has already happened. The low-resolution lurker of Canal 14. Redacted was the designation assigned to the worker who first reported the phenomenon. The irrigation canal runs for 12 miles through a stretch of corn so dense it feels like an underwater forest. It is a place of constant, rhythmic motion, the water flowing, the stalks swaying. But on October 14th, something else joined the rhythm. I was walking along the muddy bank when I noticed the first shift in the atmosphere. The air didn't just get colder, it felt thicker, as if the humidity had turned into a semi-solid jelly. Then I saw them. A crowd of people began to emerge from the cornstalks, moving with a synchronized, gliding gait. They weren't walking toward me, nor were they walking away. They were simply existing in my path. As I moved forward, they parted. It wasn't a sudden movement like a curtain blowing open. It was a fluid, silent displacement. Each person stepped back just enough to create a lane, their faces expressionless but attentive. One woman in a linen dress looked at me and whispered, "Make way for the unfinished." I didn't know who she meant until the entity rounded the bend of the canal. It did not walk so much as it stuttered through space. The entity was a humanoid shape, but it lacked the smooth transitions of living flesh. It looked like a person smeared into a blocky ghost, its body composed of jagged, cuboid segments that refused to settle. Imagine a sculpture made of melting wax that had been struck by a hammer every few seconds. The edges were never finished resolving. One moment, its shoulder was a sharp, protruding square. The next, it would melt into a rounded nub before snapping back into a jagged point. Its skin wasn't smooth. It looked like a mosaic of textures, some parts grainy like sandpaper, others shimmering with the iridescent sheen of oil on water. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense. Instead, its face featured two glowing, rectangular apertures that pulsed with a low amber light, and its mouth was a series of stacked, horizontal ridges that vibrated when it breathed. As it passed me, The crowd remained perfectly still, their bodies angled toward the entity like spectators at a play. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, a hum that resonated in my teeth. The entity's movement was jerky. It would move 3 feet forward in a smooth glide, then shudder for a heartbeat as its proportions recalculated themselves. Its arm reached out, not to touch me, but to sweep through the air. Where it passed, the water in the canal didn't ripple. It flattened into a perfect, glassy plain before slowly bubbling back into waves. I watched as its blocky hand, a cluster of 6 distinct, rectangular digits, moved toward my face. It didn't have a palm so much as a flat surface of vibrating cubes. It stopped inches from my nose. The air around it smelled of ozone and wet stone. I could see the way its edges were still working, shifting in real time like a painting that hadn't quite dried yet. One side of its torso was currently sharpening into a crystalline peak, while the other side was softening into a blurred smudge. It wasn't just moving through the world, it was trying to render itself into it, and failing to complete the task. The crowd watched with rapt attention. A small boy in the front row reached out a hand, but he stopped when the entity's head suddenly expanded into a wide, flat slab of geometry before snapping back into a recognizable dome. It leaned toward me, its amber apertures brightening. "You are almost complete," it hummed, though no mouth moved to produce the sound. The voice seemed to vibrate out of every jagged edge of its body. Then, with a sudden, violent shudder that sent a spray of water from the canal into the air, the entity's form began to collapse inward. The blocky segments started to merge rapidly. It wasn't dying, it was simply finishing its calculation. The crowd gasped in unison, their voices blending into a single soft sigh. As the shapes resolved, the entity grew smaller, more compact, and finally, perfectly smooth. For 1 second, it was a masterpiece of fluid geometry, a person of pure, finished grace. Then, as I reached out to touch its now perfect cheek, the resolution broke again. It didn't just go back to being blocky, it began to fragment into smaller cubes, shedding them like scales until it vanished into a cloud of geometric dust. The crowd dissipated instantly, melting back into the shadows of the corn as if they had never been there at all. I stood alone on the muddy bank, the silence of the canal returning, heavier than before. I looked down at my own hand, which was still trembling from the contact. I realized then that the entity hadn't just been a visitor in the canal. It was a piece of reality trying to fit into the frame. But as I walked back toward the farmstead, I noticed something peculiar about the corn stalks where it had stood. They weren't just bent, they were squared off at the tips, perfectly geometric and sharp. I looked at my own reflection in the water of the canal and saw that my thumb was now a perfect, unyielding cube. The inheritance of anticipation. My father's will was a strange, almost mocking document. It didn't just list the items he left behind, it instructed me on how to give them away, as if his death hadn't already made my ownership of them temporary. "Give the heavy oak chair to someone who sits still," it read. "Give the copper kettle to a house that is thirsty." I inherited a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, a sprawling structure of weathered timber and limestone that seemed to exhale dust every time I took a step inside. It was a lonely place, perfectly suited for the ritual my father demanded. I was to set a plate at the dinner table every evening for his memory, as if he were still sitting there, waiting to be fed. For the first week, I did so mechanically. I placed a porcelain dish in the center of the long table and sat down alone. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to count heartbeats rather than seconds. It was on the 8th night that I noticed the shadow in the window, or rather, the fact that it wasn't quite my own. I was reaching for a glass of water when I saw my reflection in the dark pane of the glass. At first, I thought nothing was wrong. But as I moved my hand toward the rim, the reflection's hand had already touched the glass a fraction of a second before mine. It wasn't just a slight delay, it was a proactive gesture. When I blinked, the reflection had already opened its eyes. I froze, my hand hovering in midair. The reflection remained there, its hand still resting on the rim of the glass, waiting for my physical body to catch up. It wasn't a mirror image in the traditional sense, it was an echo that lived ahead of me. I decided to test it. I raised my right arm slowly. The reflection's arm shot upward with a fluid, preemptive grace, reaching its peak just as my elbow began to lift. It was as if the entity in the glass were a performer who had rehearsed every single one of my movements before I even thought to perform them. By the second week, the farmhouse felt less like a home and more like a stage. The reflection lived in everything: the polished surface of the kettle, the sheen of the wooden floorboards, the still water in the basin. Every time I walked past a surface, I would see myself performing my next action before it happened. If I prepared to turn my head, the reflection had already completed the rotation. If I opened my mouth to speak, the reflection's lips were already curved into the shape of the vowel. One evening, while setting the plate for my father, I noticed a peculiar detail about the reflection's face. It didn't just mimic my expressions, it refined them. When I smiled slightly out of habit, the reflection offered a broad, beaming grin that lasted a moment longer than mine. When I frowned in concentration, its brow furrowed with a deep, dramatic intensity. It was learning my nuances, anticipating the weight of my emotions before they fully landed in my chest. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled through the eaves, and the farmhouse groaned like an old ship. I sat at the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached out to pick up a spoon, but as I moved, the reflection in the polished silver tray didn't just move first. It reacted to emotion I hadn't intended yet. My hand was still gripped around the handle of the spoon when the reflection's hand had already clutched it and lifted it toward its mouth. I gasped. The reflection responded by widening its eyes, even though my own remained steady. It began to move with a frantic, beautiful urgency. Every time I took a breath, the reflection exhaled. Every time I shifted my weight in the chair, the reflection had already settled into the new position. It was no longer just reacting, it was leading. I stood up, intending to walk toward the hearth, but the reflection on the wall pane stepped forward first. I felt a strange tugging sensation in my chest, as if an invisible thread were pulling my body toward the direction of its movement. I wasn't following the reflection anymore. I was being pulled into its timeline. I looked at the plate for my father and realized something chilling. The reflection wasn't just mimicking me, it was trying to beat me to the finish line. It wanted to experience my life a heartbeat before I did. I reached out to touch the edge of the table, but the reflection's fingers had already gripped the wood, pulling it toward its own face. I finally decided to stop moving entirely. I sat perfectly still, holding my breath, trying to give the entity nothing to anticipate. For a long minute, there was silence. Then, without warning, the reflection moved. It didn't wait for me to initiate anything. It leaned forward, its face coming inches from the surface of the wood, and it let out a tiny, silent sigh. My heart leaped into my throat. I hadn't sighed yet. The reflection had already lived through my next second, and it was now waiting patiently for me to catch up. The geometry of my mother's smile. I have spent 30 years believing that my mother was a woman of soft edges and irregular grace. In every photograph, she is the anchor, a warm presence with a crooked chin and a thumb that always seemed to be resting against her jaw. But as I grew older, I began to notice the discrepancies in her memory. She told me that when I was 3 years old, I spent my most peaceful afternoons sitting in the nursery of our century-old home, watching her paint the walls. She claimed she painted them a soft primrose yellow while I sat in the center of the floor, mesmerized by her movements. However, as I walked through that house last summer, peeling back layers of dust and history, the truth began to unravel like a fraying thread. The nursery was no longer yellow. It was a half-finished disaster of eggshell white and deep forest green. One wall was smooth and pale, while the other remained heavy with old pigment. And then there was the matter of my memory versus her telling. I remembered that afternoon not as a moment of peace, but as a moment of profound silence where I felt watched by something behind my mother's shoulder. My mother always insisted she was alone when she painted. She told me it was just us, little bird, and she would smile at the memory. But I realized then that her memories were too perfect, too curated to be entirely true. The house is old, its timber groaning with the weight of 100 years, and the nursery feels like the heaviest room in the structure. It smells of linseed oil and old wax. Last July, while cleaning the corner where the white paint met the green, I found a smudge of deep violet near the ceiling. It was too high for my mother to have reached comfortably without a stool, yet she insisted she hadn't touched that spot. That night, I stayed in the nursery late into the evening. The moonlight filtered through the cracked panes, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. I sat where I had sat as a child, waiting for the sensation of being observed to return. It did, but it was sharper than before. A sound emerged from the corner, a rhythmic, wet click, like a heavy tongue tapping against a pallet. I stood up and turned toward the source. There, standing in the shadow where the paint transitioned from white to green, was the figure she had never mentioned. It wasn't my mother, but it sat exactly where she usually did when she worked. This entity was a marvel of impossible geometry. It was perfectly, wrongly symmetrical. While humans are defined by their slight imperfections, a nose slightly off-center, an uneven brow, a limp in the stride, this thing was a masterpiece of balance. Its body was shaped like a faceted gemstone, with skin that looked like buffed copper. It had no joints. Instead, its limbs flowed into one another like melting wax. Its face was a perfect oval, and its eyes were not round but were wide, equilateral triangles. It didn't have hair. It had a crown of rigid, iridescent scales that fanned out like a peacock's tail. Most unsettling were its ears, two perfect circles positioned at the very top of its head, perfectly level with one another. I realized then why my mother's stories were so different from my own. She hadn't been painting alone. She had been trying to keep this thing from noticing her. The figure didn't move like a living creature. It moved in increments, snapping into new positions as if being edited by an invisible hand. It was standing perfectly upright, its copper skin shimmering under the moon. I felt a surge of dread as I realized how much it resembled my mother's face, but stripped of all personality. It had her wide smile, but the smile was perfectly equal on both sides, with 8 teeth showing in a row. "Are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the cavernous room. The figure didn't speak, but it reacted instantly. It snapped its body toward me, rotating on a central axis like a spinning top. Its triangular eyes didn't blink, they simply vibrated. Then it began to move toward me. It didn't walk, it glided, its copper skin making a low hum against the floorboards. With every step, it became more symmetrical, pulling the very shape of the room into its own balance. The lopsided chair by the window suddenly straightened until its legs were of identical length. The crooked molding on the ceiling leveled itself out. It was as if the entity's presence demanded that the world stop being irregular. It stopped 3 feet in front of me. It reached out a hand, not 5 fingers, but 4, each exactly the same length and width, tipped with rounded nubs. It touched my cheek. Its touch wasn't warm. It was cool and smooth like a river stone. I looked into its triangular eyes and saw not a reflection of myself, but a vision of a world where everything had a twin, where nothing was lopsided, and where nothing was ever quite enough to be unique. I finally understood why my mother always told me she was alone in the nursery. She wasn't just remembering a painting session, she was remembering the era before the figure claimed the room. She had spent her life trying to hide its perfection from me, fearing that if I saw it clearly, I would realize how much of our own messy, beautiful lives were just flaws waiting to be corrected by its steady, balanced hand. The pen pal of the Borderlands. Log entry 01. The sensor logs begin at 2300 hours. The border checkpoint is a lonely stretch of asphalt between 2 silent countries, lit only by the hum of the automated lanterns. I am stationed here alone in a small booth, tasked with watching the gate where the horizon vanishes into nothingness. It is a place of transition, a liminal space where the familiar world behind me yields to the unknown expanse ahead. There is no wind tonight, just the steady pulse of the electricity running through the wires overhead. At 2315, the smart home system, which I installed specifically to monitor my solitude and provide a sense of company in this desolate outpost, registered the first anomaly. The overhead lamp flickered once, a sharp, dry crackle of sound, and then stayed dim as if the light itself were weary. Nobody touched the dial. I sat in my chair, the wood creaking slightly under my weight, watching the dust motes dance in the weakened glow. By 2340, the system logged a command for full brightness in the corridor. There was no one in the corridor but me, sitting perfectly still at my desk. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck, that distinct sensation of being watched by a pair of eyes just out of sight. The light didn't just turn on, it bloomed like a flower opening in fast motion, illuminating the peeling paint on the walls and the heavy iron latch of the gate outside. By midnight, the lights began to behave with a strange, rhythmic intentionality. They would pulse in patterns that felt like a heartbeat, thump-thump, a pause, then thump-thump. I sat there, scratching notes into my journal, trying to ignore the way the electricity seemed to be breathing. The handwriting in my journal is my own, a messy, utilitarian scrawl formed by years of habit. But as I looked down at page 4, I noticed something peculiar. My last sentence was "the gate is open," but a new line appeared beneath it without me moving my hand. It was written in my exact style, yet the letters were leaning slightly to the left, as if they were trying to lean into someone's ear to whisper a secret. At 1 o'clock, the lights plunged into total darkness for 10 seconds before snapping back to a soft amber. The silence during those 10 seconds was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. A new sentence appeared on the page. "You look tired today." It was my handwriting, but it felt warmer, more deliberate than my own usual hurried notations. I felt a shiver run down my spine because I hadn't written it. The booth felt smaller now, the walls closing in just an inch, as if the space were being compressed by an invisible presence. The entity wasn't just appearing, it was observing. By 2:15, the lights began to dance, moving from the ceiling to the floor in a wave of gold and white. It was a fluid motion, like water rippling across a pond. Every time they shifted, another line of text bloomed on the paper. "I like the way you think," it wrote. "Then I wish I could hold your hand." The letters were leaning further left now, tilting at an aggressive angle that made them look like they were falling toward the margin. It was becoming more expressive, almost eager to communicate, as if the ink were trying to break free from the confines of the lines. I gripped my pen so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to move, terrified that any sudden motion would invite it closer, perhaps pulling it out of the paper and into the physical world. But the lights responded to my internal state. As my anxiety spiked, they turned a frantic, strobe-like violet, casting jagged shadows against the booth walls. At 3:30, the handwriting began to accelerate. The lines weren't just sentences anymore. They were observations of my physical form, recorded with clinical precision and growing affection. "Your pulse is fast," it wrote in elegant, looping script. "You are holding your breath." I finally exhaled, and a small puff of mist escaped my lips in the cooling air. "I am here, too," the journal revealed. The letters were. Leaning so far now they were almost horizontal, stretching out like arms reaching across the page to touch the edges. At 4 o'clock, the lights stabilized into a steady, gentle teal, a color I hadn't programmed and hadn't even thought of. A final, long paragraph appeared at the bottom of the page. It described my own personality with a tenderness I had never managed to achieve myself. It called me brave and thoughtful and patient. It was me, but perfected, a polished mirror of my soul that knew how to be kinder than I ever could be. The lights suddenly went out entirely, leaving only the white paper of the journal glowing faintly under the moonlight filtering through the small window. I reached out to touch the ink, expecting to feel the texture of lead and paper, but my hand met something slightly warmer than parchment, a faint, velvety heat that radiated from the words themselves. A soft sound, like a satisfied sigh, echoed in the booth, though there was no mouth to produce it. The handwriting shifted one last time, the letters finally standing perfectly straight, as if they had found their balance and were ready for me to see them clearly. It wrote, "Don't be afraid of me. I am only trying to be better than you." As I sat in the silence, the lights flickered once and died forever, but when I looked back at the page, the ink was still wet and a new word had appeared in the very center. Wait. The coat of the canyon guest. I am sitting at my kitchen table this morning, the sunlight hitting the linoleum, yet my hands still tremble with a phantom chill. They say slot canyons are geological masterpieces, sculpted by water over eons into narrow, winding corridors of sandstone. I had spent the afternoon hiking through one such labyrinth in the high desert, seeking the solitude of the stone walls. The air was dry and tasted of dust until the ground began to hum. Then, the siren started, that low, mournful wail that warns of a flash flood coming from miles away. It signaled the end of my leisure. I had to find shelter before the wall of water collapsed into the throat of the canyon. I retreated into a wide pocket of the sandstone, a natural alcove where the walls curved inward like the ribs of a giant beast. The silence that followed the siren was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drip of moisture from above. That was when I saw it. Hanging from a jagged protrusion of rock near the center of the alcove was a coat rack. It wasn't a manufactured piece of furniture. Rather, 3 sturdy branches had fused together into a perfect T-shape, and a thick mantle of velvet-soft moss had cushioned the horizontal arm. Hanging from that branch was a single, heavy overcoat. It was made of a deep, forest green wool, buttoned to the chin, with a collar so high it almost hid the shoulders. It didn't belong to me. I hadn't seen anyone else in the canyon for miles. Yet, there it hung, swaying ever so slightly despite the lack of wind. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped closer. Why would an overcoat be here, suspended in a place where only rock and dust existed? As I reached out to touch the fabric, a sound vibrated through the floor of the canyon. It was a footfall, a heavy, deliberate thud that seemed to echo from the very bottom of the gorge. It should have been a soft step, given the sandy floor, but it resonated with the force of a falling mallet. I froze. Then came another sound, a faint, almost imperceptible scuffing noise, like silk sliding over silk, where there should have been a confident stride. I realized then that something was moving in the shadows behind the coat rack. It wasn't just an object, it was a host. Slowly, I turned my head. A figure emerged from the gloom of the alcove. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, no nose to twitch or lips to curl. Instead, its head was a smooth, seamless dome of iridescent shell, like a giant pearl that had been weathered by sand. Where I should be, there were 2 horizontal slits that pulsed with a soft, amber glow. Its body was lean and elongated, covered in skin that looked like wrinkled leather, and it moved with a bizarre, disjointed grace. It walked toward me, but its gait was the source of my growing dread. Every time its front foot landed on a pebble, it produced a deafening crack, as if the stone were shattering under a hammer. But when it moved its back foot, it made no sound at all, not even a whisper of dust. It was a creature of rhythmic contradictions. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking in the vastness of the stone chamber. The entity stopped just inches from me. It didn't speak with a mouth, instead, it hummed. The sound vibrated in my teeth, a low-frequency thrum that felt like the purr of a massive engine. It raised a hand, not a 5-fingered glove, but a broad, flat paddle of skin with small ridges along the edge. It reached out and touched the overcoat hanging on the rack. "It is mine," the hum vibrated in my skull. The voice was heavy, like stones grinding together underwater. I watched as it pulled the coat off the branch. It didn't put it on with its arms. Rather, the fabric seemed to flow toward it, wrapping around its torso as if being sucked into a vacuum. As the coat settled over its shell head and leather body, the entity changed. The colors of the wool deepened, and the hum became a melodic trill. Then, the ground began to shake. A distant roar signaled that the flash flood was finally arriving, a wall of water rushing toward our sanctuary. I expected the creature to run, but it stood perfectly still. It took one step forward, its front foot booming like a drum, and then it simply merged with the shadows of the alcove. I felt a sudden gust of wind as the first spray of water hit the entrance, turning the canyon into a roar of white noise. When the water finally surged into my pocket of stone, I instinctively ducked down, shielding my head with my arms. When the flood subsided minutes later, the canyon was transformed into a shimmering pool of silt and smooth rock. I stood up, shivering, my hair plastered to my forehead. The entity was gone. The overcoat was gone. Even the branch rack had vanished as if it had been swallowed by the earth. I began to walk back toward the canyon mouth, feeling a sense of relief that I had survived the deluge and escaped the strange visitor. But then I felt something heavy brush against my shoulder, a wet, woolly sensation from behind. I spun around, expecting to see the creature with the shell head standing there in the mud. There was nothing but the dripping walls of the canyon. I took another step and then felt it again, the distinct weight of a heavy coat draped over my left arm as if someone were still holding it for me. I looked down at my empty hand and realized that while the entity was invisible to my eyes now, it had decided to keep its coat on until it found someone else to carry it. The geometry of the mist. Day 42. The honey is thickening, but the bees have begun to behave with a strange, rhythmic solemnity. They no longer buzz in chaotic swarms. They hum in unison, a low vibration that rattles the glass panes of the lighthouse gallery. I am alone on this spire of rock, surrounded by an ocean that feels less like water and more like a heavy, wet curtain. The house itself is supposed to be simple, a cylinder of stone with 3 main levels, the kitchen at the base, the library in the middle, and my sleeping loft at the peak. But lately, the architecture has developed a sense of whim. I first noticed it during the morning tea. I had walked from the kitchen into what should have been the library to find my book, only to step through the archway and find myself standing on the cold flagstones of the loft. The smell of old parchment was replaced by the scent of lavender and sleeping wool. I blinked, convinced the door had simply moved, but when I stepped back into the kitchen, the transition felt like a physical lurch, as if the house were exhaling. By day 45, the confusion became a constant companion. Each time I opened a door, the room beyond was no longer a certainty. Sometimes, the kitchen would lead to a tiny, circular pantry filled with jars of preserved fruit. Other times, it would open into a wide balcony overlooking the crashing surf. The house is rearranging its bones while I am not looking at them. It is as if the rooms are sliding past each other like shuffled cards in a deck. The fog arrived on day 50. It did not come from the sea, but from within the walls. It began as a thin, pearlescent vapor that seeped through the keyholes, smelling of crushed mint and wet stone. Unlike the outdoor mist, this indoor fog has weight. It moves like a slow-motion river, curling around the furniture with intent. I watched it today for 3 hours, sitting in a chair that used to be in the dining room but is now nestled against the hearth. The fog does not just float, it knows where things belong. It flows into the rooms first, smoothing out the wrinkles of the air before I even enter. It behaves like an architect who never sleeps, constantly pushing the walls inward or pulling them outward to accommodate its own swirling paths. Last night, the swapping became aggressive. I went to fetch a jar of honey from the kitchen, but as I crossed the threshold, the room expanded into a cavernous hall of white marble. The fog was there, thick and creamy, hugging the floor like a carpet. When I turned back to return to the loft, the door I had just exited led me into a narrow, winding staircase that spiraled upward for what felt like miles. I climbed until my lungs burned, only to emerge into a room with no ceiling at all, just a vast expanse of mist where the roof used to be. The house is hunting for its own balance, and I am merely a guest being tossed about by its internal tides. The bees are almost silent now. They seem to sense the shifting geometry. Yesterday, the fog began to pulse with a soft, rhythmic thrumming. It no longer just fills the space, it interacts with the objects. When the fog touches my wooden table, the wood softens and glows like amber. When it touches the stone walls, they ripple like water. I stayed in the center of the main hall today for an hour, watching the rooms swap around me. The kitchen door would open into a garden room filled with hanging ferns, then snap shut to reveal a dusty attic of clocks. Every time a room changed, the fog would rush to fill the vacuum, rushing like a startled intake of breath. Tonight, I sat in the middle of the tower and closed my eyes. I realized that the house is not just swapping rooms, it is trying to find me. The fog moved with purpose, pulling the loft down toward the floor, stretching the hallway until it was a thin ribbon of space. It felt as if the house were folding itself like a piece of paper. I reached out my hand and felt the mist wrap around my wrist, warm and velvety. It didn't just sit on my skin, it pulled me slightly forward, dragging me toward the center of the room where the furniture had vanished into the vapor. The bees have finally stopped humming altogether. The silence is heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I stood in the kitchen this morning and opened the door to the library, but there was no library. There was only a doorway leading into an infinite expanse of fog, where the floor fell away into a bottomless white void. I stepped forward, expecting to fall, but the house caught me. The walls folded inward, hugging me in a cocoon of stone and mist until they clicked into place. The swap is complete. Every room has moved, every wall has shifted, and the house has finally settled into its new shape. I am standing in the very center of what was once my home, but now it is a single, perfect sphere of white light and stone. There are no more doors to open, for there is nowhere left to go. I can hear the fog breathing against the walls, a soft, wet sound that echoes in the silence. The bees have moved into the mist with me, their tiny bodies suspended like jewels in amber. It is peaceful here, in this new geometry of my making. But as I sit on the floor, I realized why the house chose this shape. The fog isn't just filling the rooms anymore, it is slowly beginning to pull the walls inward toward my chest, and I can feel the stone getting closer with every breath I take. The Tundra's percussion. Host, if you can hear me through the static of this long night, please understand that I am not exaggerating. The silence out here is heavy enough to crush a ribcage. I am currently hunkered down in an old, rusted research station on the high tundra. Outside, there is a whiteout so absolute that it has erased the horizon. The sky and the ground have merged into a seamless, blinding void of alabaster. There are no mountains left to orient myself by, no trees to break the wind. It is just me, the hum of the heater, and the oppressive whiteness pressing against the glass. I started noticing things about my own reflection in the frosted window pane about 3 hours ago. At first, it was a mere curiosity. I would lift my hand to wipe away a patch of ice, and for a fraction of a second, my reflection would follow perfectly. But then, it began to lag. I stopped moving entirely, my breath hitching in my throat, yet my reflection continued the motion of reaching forward for one more beat before settling into stillness. It felt as though my image was struggling to keep up with my physical body, like a shadow trying to catch its master in a race through deep snow. By the second hour, the lag became more deliberate. I would blink, and my reflection would stay wide-eyed for a heartbeat before closing its lids. It felt less like a delay and more like an observation. It was watching me from the other side of the glass, waiting for me to finish my actions before it decided to mimic them. Then, the sound began. It wasn't a voice, but a rhythmic tapping coming from the corners of the room. It sounded like wooden mallets striking heavy strings. It was the entity, a cluster of loose piano hammers that had detached from some celestial instrument and drifted into my cabin. They didn't have a face or a body in the traditional sense. They were a swarm of polished mahogany sticks, each tipped with a felt-covered head. They floated in the air like a school of tiny, hovering fish. At first, they just bumped against the walls with a hollow thud, but as the whiteout deepened outside, they began to organize. They started to tap out my name. Not in words, but in notes. Elias, they tapped. The hammers struck the wood of the walls in rapid succession. One hammer would strike high and sharp for the first letter, while a cluster of 3 would strike a low, resonant hum for the final sound. It was a constant, percussive heartbeat in the room. But as I sat there, paralyzed by the cold, the reflection in the window changed again. It no longer just mimicked me, it began to anticipate me. I would think about reaching for my tin of tea, and my reflection's hand would already be halfway there. It was becoming a frantic, fluttering motion, moving with a fluid grace that my own stiff limbs couldn't manage. And the hammers, they grew faster. They stopped merely tapping my name and began to strike it in different moods. Sometimes they tapped Elias with a mournful, slow pace, like a funeral march. Other times, they struck it with a frantic, staccato urgency that made the very floorboards vibrate. Then came the moment of true dread. I stood up to reach for the door handle, and my reflection didn't just move, it moved before I did. It leaned forward toward the glass, its face stretching into a wide, silent grin while my own mouth remained set in a neutral line. The hammers stopped their frantic tapping. They hovered in the center of the room, perfectly still, like a bouquet of wooden flowers waiting for a breeze. Then, They struck one final time. A single hammer hit the wall with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot. My reflection didn't mimic it. Instead, it pressed its palms against the inside of the glass and exhaled a cloud of frost that moved toward me. I realized then that the hammers weren't just naming me, they were counting down. And my reflection wasn't trying to keep up with me anymore. It was trying to step out. I watched as the reflection reached for the edge of the frame, its hand overlapping the line between inside and outside. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my own chest, as if an invisible wire were pulling my heart toward the window. The hammers began to strike again, but this time they weren't tapping letters. They were mimicking the sound of heavy footsteps moving on a wooden floor, footsteps that were approaching from inside the glass. I held my breath, watching my reflection's fingers curl around the corner of the frame. With a sudden, violent jerk, the reflection pulled itself forward. It didn't just move, it swapped places with me in a blur of motion. For a second, there was a vacuum of silence, and then I felt myself pressed against the cold glass. I looked out at my own face looking back at me from the interior of the room. My reflection, now occupying my body, stood up straight and took a step toward the heater. It reached out a hand and touched my cheek with a warmth that shouldn't have been there. I am now the one trapped in the glass, watching my own body move through the cabin. The hammers are silent now, but they are still hovering around the reflection's head like a crown of floating wood. I can see it clearly. Myself is looking at the door, then back at me with a look of profound satisfaction. It knows that while I am watching the world from the inside, it finally gets to walk through it. The whiteout outside continues, but here in the room, the air feels heavy with the weight of the swap. My reflection, my new body, turned toward the window one last time before it turned off the lantern, leaving me in the dark. I can still feel its gaze on me from just an inch away, even though I am now the thing being watched. The cadence of the concrete vault. I am recording these notes as a final summary for the maintenance department, though I suspect my actual report, the one detailing the structural integrity and acoustic anomalies of Sector 4, was lost during the evacuation. If you are reading this, it means the silence has finally taken hold. The parking garage was supposed to be empty. It is a brutalist slab of concrete, subterranean and cavernous, designed to house 300 vehicles. Yet, on that Tuesday, I stood in the center of Level 3 with nothing but my toolkit and the heavy humidity of the underground air. I had intended to check the overhead lights, but something pulled me toward the northern ramp. It started as a vibration in the soles of my boots, a rhythmic thrumming that didn't belong to any engine or ventilation fan. Then came the sound. From the far end of the corridor, where the shadows pooled like spilled ink, a lullaby began to drift. It wasn't a human voice, at least not a clear one. It was a melodic hum, woven from 3 distinct tones that seemed to rise and fall in a perfect, hypnotic loop. It felt strange coming from the void because there were no people nearby, no cradles, and no furniture to ground the music. It simply hung in the air, drifting over the pillars like smoke. I began to walk toward it, my own footsteps echoing against the ceiling. Thump! My left foot hit the concrete. Thump! My right foot followed. Then, a split second later, a third sound arrived, a softer, muffled click that didn't match mine. It was as if something were walking with me, perfectly mimicking my stride, but adding a deliberate extra beat between each of our steps. I stopped. The clicking stopped too. I took one more step forward. Thump. The echo followed. Thump. Click. I realized then that the entity wasn't just following me, it was counting me. It was observing my pace and adding its own punctuation to my movement. As I moved deeper into the garage, the lullaby grew louder, richer in texture. It began to sound like a mother singing to a child who had no face to rest against her cheek. The closer I got to the source of the music, the more the footsteps intensified. Every time I paused, that extra click would linger for a heartbeat longer than my own, as if it were savoring the silence before its next turn. I started to feel the weight of it behind me. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. The air grew cooler, smelling faintly of old parchment and wet stone. My heart hammered against my ribs as I noticed that whenever I turned my head, I could see nothing but the vast expanse of gray pillars. Yet, when I closed my eyes, I could feel the entity's gaze, a heavy, pressing sensation on the back of my neck. It was close now. The lullaby reached a crescendo of humming notes, and the footsteps became rapid. Asterisk, thumb click. Thumb click, asterisk, it was hurrying to keep up with me. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking my speed, it was trying to anticipate where I would land next. I decided to run. My feet flew across the concrete, a frantic percussion of soles hitting stone. The entity responded in kind, its extra click becoming a sharp, metallic snap. It was running faster than me now, its rhythm weaving through mine like a needle threading silk. I could hear it breathing, not a human breath, but a rhythmic hiss, like air escaping a cracked leather bellows. I reached the center of the garage and spun around, expecting to see a towering beast or a hovering ghost. Instead, there was only the lingering vibration of the music. The lullaby suddenly cut off on a high, sustained note that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then I felt it. A sudden, violent shift in the air just inches from my face. The entity didn't appear as a solid shape. It moved like a ripple in water. It had a body of woven copper wires and velvet moss, with a head that resembled an oversized, blooming peony made of hammered bronze. It had no eyes, only a series of vibrating membranes across its face that hummed when it looked at me. It didn't move toward me, it simply existed in my space. I held my breath as the extra click finally joined my own perfectly, merging into a single, unified beat. The entity leaned forward, its bronze petals shivering with a faint metallic chime. I could feel its warmth, a dry heat like a radiator left on in an empty room. It reached out with a limb that looked like a twisted vine of glass and touched my shoulder. In that moment, the lullaby returned, but it wasn't coming from the air anymore. It was coming from inside my own chest, vibrating through my ribs as if I had become the nursery for its music. I stood perfectly still, terrified to move, afraid that any shift would break the spell. The entity pulled back slightly, its membranes fluttering in a satisfied hum. Then, it did something unexpected. It took one final step forward, and instead of adding an extra click, it subtracted one. It stepped into my space so completely that for a second, we were moving as a single unit. I felt the copper wires brush against my skin, and then it vanished into the shadows of the rafters above, leaving only the faint smell of ozone. I stood alone in the center of the garage for a long time, the silence feeling heavier than before. I finally gathered the courage to walk back toward the exit, my own footsteps now sounding lonely and incomplete. When I reached the heavy steel doors of the entrance and looked back one last time, I saw the entity perched on a pillar, watching me. It didn't move, but it let out one final, tiny hum. As I stepped out into the night air, I realized that while the entity was gone, the music hadn't stopped. It was now playing faintly in my ears, even as the garage doors slammed shut behind me. Every time I take a step now, there is still that phantom click following me, just a fraction of a second late, waiting for me to catch up. The echo of the Unspooled. I arrived at the lockkeeper's cottage during the height of the autumn mist, a time when the canal feels less like a body of water and more like a silver ribbon winding through a graveyard of trees. The fog doesn't just sit on the surface, it breathes into the cottage, clinging to the timber walls and dampening the sound of my own footsteps. My only task was simple: maintain the gates, watch the water rise and fall, and manage the field of return. This small patch of land behind the cottage was a geological anomaly. It was a rectangular strip of soil that seemed hungry, capable of swallowing anything tossed into its dirt, yet it possessed a peculiar habit of giving things back. At first, I thought it was merely a trick of the shifting mud, but as the weeks passed, the field's personality revealed itself. If I buried a copper coin, it would surface by morning on the opposite side, gleaming like a new penny. If I threw in a withered rose, it would reappear with its petals still vibrant, as if the earth had caught it in a moment of perfection and refused to let it decay. The field didn't just hold things, it curated them. The first time I saw the entity, it emerged from the center of the field after a heavy rain. It wasn't a creature of flesh or bone, but a sprawling shape made entirely of unspooled cassette tape. Imagine 1,000 miles of magnetic ribbon tangled into a towering, undulating mass that stood roughly 7 feet tall. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a continuous loop of brown film that rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. It moved with a rhythmic, shuffling motion, the tape segments overlapping and sliding over one another with a soft, wet hiss. As I approached it, the entity began to vibrate. It didn't speak in words initially, but in textures. It produced a low hum that felt like the static between radio stations. I realized then that the field wasn't just returning objects, it was recording them. Every sound made within the cottage, every footfall on the mud, and every sigh I uttered was being captured by the tape beast. The entity began to whisper back everything ever recorded over its surface. It didn't just repeat my words exactly, it layered them. When I whispered, "hello," the entity replied with 100 overlapping echoes of "hello," some sharp and clear, others muffled as if heard through water or thick velvet. It was a living archive of every vibration that had touched the soil. By the second month, the field became demanding. I began to bury things more deliberately to see how it would react. I buried a heavy iron key, and the entity spent 3 days weaving its tape loops into a complex braid, whispering the metallic clink of the key hitting the ground in a continuous loop. I buried my favorite leather book, and the next morning, the entity had produced the book, but it was now wrapped in a layer of fine, translucent tape that shimmered like dragonfly wings. The whispers became more frequent, less rhythmic. They were no longer just echoes, they were memories. At night, when the fog pressed against the windows, the entity would wander into the cottage. It didn't walk so much as flow, its ribbon body trailing behind it like a comet's tail. It would brush against the furniture, and every time it touched an object, that object's history was whispered back to me. One evening, I sat by the hearth and watched the entity move toward my wooden chair. As the tape ribbons swept over the wood, I heard the sound of a carpenter's saw from a century ago, followed by the groan of the timber settling. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were sensations. I felt the coldness of the rain that had fallen on the trees during the cottage's construction. The entity grew larger as it gathered more data. It began to pull fragments of my own life into its mass. When I touched its shifting body, I heard my mother's laugh from 20 years ago, perfectly preserved in a ribbon of brown film. It was beautiful until it became overwhelming. The middle of the season brought a change in the field's temperament. The objects I buried started to return in pairs or triples. If I buried a single apple, I would find 2 by evening, one perfect, one slightly bruised as if it had been held in someone's hand for an extra hour. The entity began to pulse with a steady, heartbeat-like thrum. Its tape ribbons were no longer just tangled. They were beginning to knot into complex geometric shapes that shifted as the entity moved. It started to seek out my voice specifically. Whenever I stopped speaking, it would fill the silence with a frantic flurry of every word I had uttered since arriving at the canal. Water, it would hiss. Mist. Cold. Why? It was pulling the words out of its own ribbon body as if plucking them from a harp. Then came the night of the great unspooling. The fog became so thick that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. The entity didn't just stay in the field. It expanded until it filled the entire cottage, its ribbons hanging from the rafters like weeping willow branches. Every inch of the room was saturated with sound. It wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming every recorded moment at once. The clatter of my breakfast dishes, the whistle of the wind outside, and the deep thrum of the canal water merged into a single, overwhelming symphony of history. I stood in the center of the room, paralyzed by the sheer volume of time being played back at me. I reached out and grabbed a loose strand of the tape. It was cool to the touch, smooth like silk but with a slight graininess. As I pulled it, the entity let out a long, melodic whine that sounded like a cello string being bowed. The sound traveled through my arm and into my chest. I realized then that the field wasn't just returning what I put in, it was digesting it, processing it, and rearranging it until it became part of itself. It was a collector of moments. In the final week of the season, the entity reached its peak. It had absorbed so much that it began to change color, shifting from a dull brown to a deep, bruised plum hue. The whispers were no longer external. They felt as though they were happening inside my own skull. I could hear the sound of my own breathing echoed back at me half a second after I took the breath. I buried one last thing, a small silver locket containing a lock of hair. That night, the field gave it back, but the entity had woven the locket into its very core. It didn't just return the object, it returned the feeling of the person who wore it. The silence that followed was profound. The next morning, the fog lifted slightly, and I stepped outside to find the field empty. Every object I had buried, the keys, the books, the apples, the locket, had vanished. The entity was gone too, having finally exhausted its capacity for new data. The cottage was still, the canal was calm, and the mud of the field looked as if it had never been disturbed at all. Yet, as I stood there in the morning light, I realized that while the objects were gone, their echoes remained trapped in the soil. I took a step forward, and for a moment, the silence felt heavy. Then, from deep beneath the surface of the mud, I heard a single, tiny whisper, my own voice, saying my name, perfectly clear, as if the field was still recording me even now. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.